Okay, for more on this, let's bring in political commentator John Kavulich. He joins me live from Istanbul. He's also the president of the U.S.-Cuba Trade and Economic Council. Great to have you here with us on TRT World. I mean, as I was talking there with Craig Boswell, we are getting answers to some questions, but, again, those answers are leading us to more questions. We don't know what exactly is going on in the region right now, especially in terms of the domestic situation in Venezuela. I understand that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is missing, but no one really knows anything about his whereabouts, whether or not he's in the United States right now or not. Again, that's something that has not been confirmed. So just, first and foremost, let me get your reaction on the unfolding situation.
What we have is, basic situation is going to continue to unfold, and it's going to be the question of regime change. And has regime change been accomplished in terms of changing the behavior of a regime or changing the personnel in the regime? And with Venezuela, we have Mr. and Mrs. Maduro departing. Seemingly and quite likely, they would have been extracted to one of the vessels, the U.S. vessels in the Caribbean, and then from there to Florida. And we may very well see, Nicolas Maduro in the southern district of the federal court in Miami. Sort of many years ago, we saw Manuel Noriega, Panama, the same thing. But the question is going to be, does the government of Venezuela, now under President or interim President Rodriguez, does it change its diplomatic and commercial behavior? And does it change the relationship it has with Cuba, which for the Cubans today, this is pretty much, they're receiving shock and awe. They planned that this potentially could come, but now it's here. And the unknown is, how does the Venezuelan government change its relationship with Cuba? Because from the U.S. point of view, that's incredibly important, because if Venezuela can lessen support to Cuba, then that can mean that President Trump can also, sort of like a pool table bank shot, he can change Venezuela and change Cuba.
John, I think it's fair to say that it was a successful operation, especially if you look at it from a military standpoint. They were able to capture Nicolas Maduro and flew him out of the country. But I think it's about precedent, right? What if China does this to Taiwan tomorrow? Or what if Russia does this to Ukraine tomorrow? I mean, how is the U.S. going to justify this?
The U.S. international law was written by lawyers. And it was written by lawyers in a way that it can be interpreted. And governments interpret laws, their own, and those they sign up for, whether it's at the United Nations, whether it's NATO, whether it's European Union, whether it's the International Criminal Court. And we see constantly, countries will make decisions that someone's going to scream bloody murder, that this was against international law, it violates principles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, it's done. It's over. Saddam Hussein, he was removed. Even then, there were critics. There are going to be critics about this. But I suggest to you, not as a proponent of
John, but to that point about Saddam Hussein in Iraq, I mean, yes, he was removed, but at what cost? Hundreds of thousands of people died. Daesh was born as a result of the U.S. invasion as well.
Absolutely, and there are consequences to every action. And I'm not a proponent of what President Trump has done here. But what I have seen over the last decades is governments make decisions, they justify them, and then eventually other countries sort of move on, because then there's something else that's a problem. And in my world with respect to Cuba, I've been watching this for 32 years. And so I've seen this constant, peak and valley of, will Fidel Castro get overthrown, and will government change? Will his brother? Will the current president Diaz-Canel? And in the end, there's nothing quite to the tipping point. And so I think that, what we need to see now is, okay, Mr. Maduro is out. But does that mean that the government of Venezuela demonstratively changes in any way? We don't know that yet.
Right.
But the traditional model suggests that the government will retrench to show that it's strong within the country, to try to rally diplomatic support. And this is where it gets interesting, because you're going to have a lot of countries that don't like Venezuela, but they also don't like President Trump. They don't like what President Trump did, but they need to balance that criticism with the fact that they're negotiating a trade agreement with the Trump administration. So how critical can we really be when we know a president is watching television all day long, taking notes on who criticizes him, and then a year from now, someone's in a meeting, a head of state, a head of government with President Trump, and it's about some very important deal or very important issue, and President Trump just blurts out, wait a minute, didn't you criticize me for Venezuela? Well, I think then we're going to have 35% tariffs. None of this is good. None of this, is sensical. But unfortunately, it's the reality of 2026 with the Trump-Vance administration.
And the reality is, if you are the president of the United States, you can get away with anything.
It's sort of that flippant, you can get away with it until you can't. In his case, it ends on 12 o'clock on the 20th of January, 2029, when his term's over. That's when he will no longer be able to do what he is doing. And there are, too, quietly, some governments and some head of state. We saw this, in Libya. We saw it to some extent in Iraq. We've seen it in Syria, where sometimes heads of state and heads of government in some of these international forums, or even bilaterally, they get together and it's like, hey, look, we could never have told you publicly that we were supporting of you, but you did the dirty work. Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has said this publicly, that, hey, all these governments have said, I went after Hezbollah, I went after Iran, I went after Hamas, I went into Gaza, and they privately thanked me for it. Now, we don't know how much of that is true.
Right.
But that is a part of this, the narrative. And of course, President Erdogan would be the first one to say publicly that it's, the what you did to achieve the goals, I have a real problem with.
John, now let's try to read Donald Trump's mind. See, I understand it's something that's almost impossible, but let's try to do that anyway. What do you think was the biggest factor that influenced Donald Trump to launch these attacks on Venezuela? Because, see, as someone who has covered U.S. elections, especially the last one when Donald Trump ran his presidential campaign, and I remember one of his biggest campaign promises was to ensure that America does not get involved in another war. But here we are today. Donald Trump, certainly his policies right now are not aligning with the America First policy. So, of course, that's not one factor that influenced him, right? So what do you think could be, what do you think possibly influenced Donald Trump if America First was not the case?
I think he, in his mind, he will say what he has done in Venezuela is America First. And this is, you've covered him. This is a guy that can reconstruct and almost any argument to fit the mood, the moment he's in. And, if you confront him, Mr. President, you said this. No, I didn't. Mr. President, here's the video of you saying this. I never said it, fake news. It suspends reality. But this is the guy we're dealing with. And so when his team, came to him, they said, well, first, Mr. President, we hit these boats, and then someone said, every time we hit a boat, 25,000 Americans are going to be saved. And so in his mind, he now starts calculating, whoa, this is the biggest, this is the best. Now I'm saving 1 million people's lives. So that gets in his head that is America First because I'm protecting Americans. Then someone comes to him and said, we got to grab Maduro. And they show him a picture of Manuel Noriega in handcuffs out of a U.S. helicopter in Miami facing justice. And for President Trump, it's a moment, it's a visual. And we know that. He loves visuals. So he sees, oh, wow, this is great. Maybe I can go to Miami and be there when he's brought to the jail, or be there on the tarmac of the airport in Miami or West Palm Beach, and I can welcome him to the United States, even though he'll be wearing handcuffs and he won't be able to shake my hands. So it's very performative. The optics are very much there. But he doesn't look at, I'm at war with Venezuela. Very Putin-esque. For President Trump, this is a special military operation, and that for President Trump, unlike President Putin, President Trump is able to say, I did my job, I did what I said I would do, mission accomplished, and we move on until, of course, we start hearing from the next government of Venezuela, and we'll see what kind of behavior they're going to exhibit.
Where do you think this leaves President Donald Trump's hopes of getting the Nobel Peace Prize?
He's sort of, I think that if the Nobel Committee, ironically, the founder of the Nobel Prizes, he invented dynamite. So that's sometimes lost on people to remember the origins of this award. He somewhat is more inclined to be nominated for a new category, which would be the Nobel War Prize. That he might have more lineage there, but it's quite doubtful the Nobel Committee is ever going to give him anything. Primarily, they don't like him, and they somewhat have even telegraphed that publicly, members of the Norwegian parliament, the Norwegian government. And it's unseemly that he campaigns for it, sort of like adding his name to the John F. Kennedy Center with not asking anyone or whatever, just sort of putting his name up there. So they look at him as a narcissist, as someone who just needs to live for television, for using his big black Sharpie to sign something he can show the media. But he could, Russia and Ukraine could sign an agreement today ending their military fighting. And both President Putin and President Zelensky could say, we're stopping fighting because of President Trump. My prediction, he still doesn't win the Peace Prize.
Fascinating insights, John Kavulich. Thanks very much for joining me here on TRT World. I really appreciate your taking out the time.